Warning: the following story contains mentions of domestic violence, child abuse, child neglect, and alcoholism. My grandfather was a skinwalker, but not in the way you'd think. A Creepy Conceptions original. Artwork by Kanarushi. My grandfather was a skinwalker, but not in the way you think. I've always been a skeptic when it comes to the paranormal, and this situation is doing nothing to change that. Still, here I am, sitting alone in the brightly lit room of my lab in the hours of early morning with several tiny pieces of my grandfather's skin lying in front of me, taunting me. A harsh reality to a truth I wanted so badly to deny. I guess I'm getting ahead of myself. For you to understand, I have to start from the beginning. I must tell you exactly how it was that I came to this terrible conclusion. I guess I should start by explaining who I am and, most importantly, why I have my grandfather's skin in front of me. My name is Abigail Rivera, and I am a forensic cytologist. A cytologist is someone who studies human cells. As a forensic cytologist, I can determine which cells come from which organs, which is particularly helpful when dealing with cases of sexual assault and murder. I spent the first 10 years of my career working in a government laboratory. During this time, I developed ideas to advance our techniques and refine the science. I began lecturing at a local medical school where I eventually landed a grant that allowed me to become a principal investigator in its cytopathology and histopathology research department. We were sent samples of specimen from recent crimes to decades old cold cases. At any one time, our facility will be investigating multiple techniques. I've personally spearheaded several of these in my 6 years as a PI, but the one that is most important to this story involves the recovery of ink from the tattooed skin of a victim and determining its origin. This has many applications, and I'll try to explain it as clearly and concisely as possible. The idea came to me while I was investigating fluid samples from a Jane Doe that was found near a road several miles away from any known town. Our agency was the closest one with a full forensics lab. It was the middle of winter, which made the time of death unclear due to the slowing of decomposition. The cold also preserved enough skin to reveal two tattoos on the victim's body. Not knowing where she had come from, descriptions of these tattoos were broadcast across the country. 2D photo reconstructions were released, but no one claimed to recognize them. Detectives fanned out from the area where she was found and started going through missing persons cases. Dozens of law enforcement agencies were contacted, both from surrounding areas and from major cities directly connected to the road where she was found. But after multiple dead ends, I knew the case would soon grow cold. I'll spare you the graphic details, but the ritualistic way in which she appeared to have been killed, combined with the fact that she was found so far away from civilization, led several criminal profilers and anyone with the most basic knowledge of forensic psychology, myself included, to believe that Jane would be the first victim of an organized serial killer that would soon strike again. We were racing time, but in order to identify the killer, we first had to identify the victim. The victim had two small tattoos, both black. The first was three little stars behind her right ear. The second was a flowering vine that wrapped around her left ankle. I approached the lead detective on the case with the idea of creating an ink profile from each tattoo and matching them against the most commonly used ink brands in the country, along with the brands used by the professional tattoo artists in the towns closest to where the body was found, in order to narrow down our search. I forgot to mention, the forensic pathologist had determined her age to be between 16 and 20 years old. This was due to her collarbones still having both growth plates active while all the plates of her arms and legs were completely fused. This is important because it meant that her tattoos had to have been recent, within just a few years, which meant that favored ink brands and their compositions were less likely to have been changed. Using several samples of the tattooed skin, I checked for the presence of products banned by the FDA. If any of these products had been present, comparing the ink to FDA approved brands would have been pointless. I was also pleased to find that each tattoo were of different brands. I determined the chemical compositions of several brands of black ink. Allow me to emphasize that the main ingredient of each brand, along with the percentages of each ingredient present, act as a sort of fingerprint for that brand. No two brands would have the same fingerprint. It took several weeks, especially since many of the widely used distributors only sold to licensed artists. But once the samples started coming in, I found the match much sooner than I had anticipated. The brand gave us a list of US based distributors, and these distributors gave us a list of clients closest to the area where Jane was found. When the second match came in, the lead detective cross matched the lists. There were a couple of clients on both lists, and only a few in the surrounding areas where Jane had failed to match any of the missing persons. The detective made concentric circles spreading out from where the body was found and contacted the agencies serving the areas that had at least one client from each list or one client on both lists. A missing persons case from a city almost twice as far as the original radius had many similarities. Contrary to what you may believe, law enforcement agencies don't normally have information on other agencies' cases, so the radius made a huge difference in the case, especially since the original case was a missing persons case, not a homicide. Anyways, the original Jane's face had been severely mutilated by the killer, but the tattoo descriptions matched. Both of Jane's parents and two older brothers offered to provide DNA samples, and Jane was renamed Natalie Hanson. She was 18 years old, a senior in high school, a good student, and worked part time at a drive through ice cream parlor. An average kid without any obvious high risk behaviors, of average popularity from an average suburb, who simply did not return home after a Sunday evening shift. It was a weekend and she had driven her mother's car to work. The parlor closed at 7. She was normally home by 7:30. At 7:35, her mother started calling. Her father started calling. They called the parlor. No one answered. The two brothers drove to the store. They found the shop completely closed up. They also found the car keys near the curb stop. Police were on scene by 8. I say all of these things so that you'll better understand why we knew she wouldn't have known her killer, and that would make them harder to find. We kept the ink profiles for future use. As for Natalie's killer, he was caught. Natalie had been his second victim. He had 5 total. Fast forward to about 3 or 4 months ago. Grandpa was sick and he wasn't going to get better. When his health started to decline, my parents insisted he and my grandmother move in with them so that she wouldn't have to care for him alone. I arranged to take a 2 week vacation so that I could travel to my hometown and spend time with him while we could both still enjoy it. Unfortunately, during that time, Grandpa suddenly became weak and was admitted to the hospital. A urinary tract infection had spread to his kidneys, and he was receiving antibiotics. Since his immune system was compromised, his doctor advised that he have round the clock care during treatment. It was the night before he was set to be discharged. His primary care doctor was going to visit him at the hospital in the morning and determine if he was fit to leave. Arrangements were being made for Grandpa to enter hospice care and have a nurse visit him daily. To those who don't know, hospice care, also called end of life or palliative care, is care that eases the symptoms of a progressive disease process while not directly attempting to reverse or treat it. This generally means no surgeries or aggressive therapies that would simply prolong an inevitable outcome, along with the pain and discomfort of a seriously diminished quality of living. My parents, grandmother, and I sat around the dinner table, simply enjoying each other's company. Grandma was trying to make peace with what would soon come. She really was, but the last couple of days had been particularly difficult. Because of this, my mom tried to distract her by asking me about a case I had briefly mentioned earlier that year. I had already told both my parents almost all of the information that I knew, but I understood what they were doing and recounted the story for Grandma's sake. It was a rare case involving the Oregon State Police, USDA Forest Service, and the FBI. It was a very delicate, ongoing investigation going back a few years. A cultist society hidden somewhere in the area of the Umatilla National Forest was suspected of kidnapping, coercion, and human sacrifice. I wasn't given much more information than that, which was expected. A murder in a small rural town in Southern California with absolutely zero tourists a year led local authorities to raise the alarm. The woman had moved to an RV park 2 years prior, and not much was known about her. She stayed to herself, and she had no family. She said she was from a larger city in California and just wanted to get away. Naturally, the townspeople were suspicious. Not many people move to the middle of nowhere, purposefully isolate themselves from the locals, have the most vague backgrounds, and absolutely no way to contact family, and no mail, without having anything to run from. And that's exactly what the townspeople had told police when the smell emanating from the mystery woman's RV began to overwhelm the neighbors. They didn't find the woman, but they did find many of her internal organs lying on the ground and on tables inside the RV. No bones, no face. Some of the organs were stuffed into the fridge and freezer, possibly in an attempt to delay the smell so that more distance could be put between the crime scene and the killers before the body was discovered. Salt was poured onto the intestines and piles of viscera on the floor. The crime lab determined from evidence not shared with me that the murder could be linked to the cult and that she had been murdered for fleeing. The fridge was almost immediately closed and transported to a forensics lab plugged in to protect the evidence. And that's where they found it. A, well, they found the skin of her hand, almost fully intact and inside out. It had been carefully removed, unlike the rest of the organs. When they examined the skin, they saw a tattoo, but it wasn't the tattoo they were expecting to see. A symbol was tattooed onto the skin of each of the members of the cult. Apparently, the woman had covered this tattoo with a small butterfly. At least, that was a theory. The forensic pathologist overseeing the autopsy immediately sent the sample intact without any further evaluation other than the basics pictures, measurements, fingerprints, and the like to the FBI's state of the art facility in Quantico. The FBI is state of the art because they are always learning, always improving, and always on top of any and all published reports from scientists all over the world. It wasn't long before I was contacted, and the forensics team overseeing her case asked me to come to Quantico, all expenses paid, and do something that had never been done before. The cover tattoo had been expertly done, and scientists were unable to separate it from the original. The FBI had been implementing my ink signature techniques for years, but they wanted to see if I could help them do something that had never been done. The ink with the tattoo underneath likely wouldn't match any profile, but they believed that they could maybe isolate them enough to uncover the image underneath by studying the different compositions and tracing where the underlying ink was. They were working with a very small sample and they knew they would only have one shot. I was on a plane the following weekend. The idea the scientists at Quantico had come up with was brilliant and very similar to the one that had sprung to life inside my head and kept playing itself on repeat. They wanted to take different samples from the inside and the outside of the tattoo and determine the differences in chemical compositions, isolate a compound unit to the center one, and create a forensic tag. Sections of the skin no more than a few cells thick would be precisely reassembled and fixed. They would then be exposed to a solution of tags that would only bind to the original tattoo and reveal the underlying pattern. I modified their plan by creating antibodies, or tags, for compounds that were unique to both inks. Several reassembled slices would be fixed to the slides by proteins that would be present on the surfaces of the cells responsible for holding the ink in place, the phagocytes. I'll spare you the details of that process, but different layers of skin cells would be tagged with unique compounds to each ink, and the fluorescent images would be superimposed. Other layers would be tagged with all the antibodies, but with different colors, creating contrast. We would use these images to create the best possible view of the underlying tattoo. Even with their state of the art equipment, the process was time consuming, but in the end, it worked. The underlying symbol was revealed. I wasn't told whether or not it matched the cult symbol, but based on the tone of voice of the agent that later called to thank me, asking if I would be open to future collaborations, I got the feeling that I had given them exactly what they needed. After dinner, I was cleaning the dishes when my grandmother came up beside me and grabbed a rag, slowly drying one small pan absent-mindedly as she looked at nothing in particular. I smiled at her. I could tell she was interested in my story as I was speaking at the dinner table, though I spared many of the details, only telling them there was a body and that I managed to reveal a tattoo that was exceptionally well covered and blended with the one on top. She asked me about this, about if I would be able to repeat the procedure. Well, yes, but it is a very rare situation. I don't anticipate having to do it again in my lifetime. Well, she started. Then she went quiet again. Her behavior seemed strange to me. I grabbed the rag and dish from her hand as I began drying what couldn't be placed in the dishwasher. She wasn't really doing such a good job. Your grandfather, and you know the tattoo he has on his left arm and shoulder. The bird? I asked. Yes. She stopped talking again. I can't say I wasn't a bit frustrated. Tell you what, Grams, why don't I make us some herbal tea and we can sit out on the porch and talk? Please don't think you have to be afraid to tell me or ask me anything. She looked up into my eyes and nodded, her face blank, expression pensive, before heading outside to the backyard through the kitchen door. Once the tea was ready, I went to join my grandmother on the patio. I kicked the kitchen door closed with my foot and sat down next to her on the round metal table. I saw that she had already lit the little candle that served as a mosquito repellent. She had a shawl around her shoulders, and she was staring off into the dark and empty backyard. The the tattoo your grandfather has is a cover-up. I have asked him many times to tell me what it covers, but he always said that he never wanted to think about the past. He, he had a rough time growing up, right? I nodded. From what I knew, Grandpa had an alcoholic father who frequently abused him and his mother physically and emotionally. He met Grandma for the first time in grade school when she stood up for him and got him help. She had noticed that something was wrong, and instead of picking on him like the other kids in class, she got her parents involved. His mother suffered from a severe depression, and even after being removed from the situation, it took years of therapy for her to learn how to be a mother to him again. I had never met my great grandfather. After that, my grandparents lost touch but reconnected in their late teens. The rest was history. He said his father had done terrible things to him. He said his mother never felt like a mother or even a human. He thought horrible things. He got the tattoo when he was in a bad place, but it encouraged him to do better. I remember that when we became friends in our final year of school, he never took his jacket off. I just assumed that it was some scar his father had given him. He was always looking forward, and he always said he wanted to leave the past behind. When we got together, after all that stuff happened, and he was really there for me, and we were there for each other, he finally took his jacket off. He pulled up his sleeve. He had gotten a tattoo. He said it was a cross between a phoenix and a bird of paradise. He told me that he wasn't real until I showed him how to live, that he was born inside of an empty shell because of me. That was the reason for the phoenix. The bird of paradise was because he wanted to be with me forever. I smiled. That's really beautiful, Grandma. She had told me most of this information before. She smiled for a bit, and then her smile fell. It was years later when I wanted to get my own tattoo. He said he wanted to take me to his tattoo artist in a city nearby, that he was a very good artist who did a remarkable job on his. When we went in, the artist recognized him. He asked to see the tattoo on his shoulder. That's when he said, "That cover up is doing nicely. Looks like you took really good care of it." I was stunned. I didn't realize the tattoo was a cover up. But Jim just smiled and told him he'd done a remarkable job, and that's why he'd chosen to take me there. She paused for a moment, taking a sip of her tea. Grandma's brother had lost his life in World War II. On her own shoulder, she had a tattoo of a guardian angel. I waited patiently for a minute before she finally spoke. He never told me what was underneath, what he tried so hard to cover. He said that it was done by someone who no longer existed. He wanted to love his life with me. He didn't want to be reminded of the past. I'm not sure why, but I obsessed over that tattoo for a time. Something just didn't sit right with me. I knew I should have respected his wishes, but when he took your uncle away on his first hunting trip, I drove out to that artist and asked him what the tattoo was. I still feel ashamed, but I needed to know. Something wasn't right. Maybe it was something I could help him with. I felt that he knew everything about me, but I didn't know everything about him. I didn't know that. The artist wouldn't tell you? I asked. He didn't know. He told me that the tattoo had already been covered up, that your grandfather had made a huge blotch of black to cover it, and that it was the most challenging cover up he had ever done, especially due to the amount of ink Jim used that he apparently didn't have to use. He called it his masterpiece. We sat in silence for a moment. She didn't have to ask me what she wanted me to do, and she knew that. I paused in the face of the duality of the ethical dilemma presented to me. On the one hand, I wanted to respect my grandfather's wishes that the past stay in the past. He had come out of adversity and, against all odds, made himself a new man, a kind, loving, caring man that stood up for the weak and encouraged the goodwill of the strong. Whatever happened to him, it was like he couldn't live with the shame. He wanted that part of him to die forever. But my grandfather was nearing his last days on earth. He was encouraging my grandmother to live many more years for him so that they would have a lot to talk about when he met her in heaven. He told her that he was sorry he got to go first, but that he wasn't abandoning her. He just respected the call of his creator. He wanted something to be kept secret, and I was personally inclined to respect that. However, the way my grandmother looked, it greatly disturbed her. Something about it seemed wrong to her. It was an alarm that never stopped sounding. Perhaps you could ignore it for a moment, but it would always call back your attention. Remember a time where you got caught up in something and heard your microwave go off multiple times before you actually did something about it? Anyways, my grandmother wholeheartedly loved my grandfather, and she was upset at having to lose him, her best friend and love of her life, a commitment lasting multiple decades, backed by an even longer friendship, started with one act of kindness from one child to another. And there was something else, something just beneath the surface, lurking, causing ripples. Something that my grandmother saw that she couldn't quite explain, that she couldn't relay to another, that only her face could convey. And I understood. I understood this unknown, unnamed thing somewhere deep inside of me. I knew it was important, pressing even. I didn't need to know why to feel it. In the end, I told my grandmother the steps she would need to take as my grandfather's power of attorney. He was becoming more and more confused, not remembering where he was, thinking he was still living in the house he had built for his wife so long ago. She registered to donate my grandfather's remains to the university, claiming to my mother and her other children that it was for the betterment of society. We both took solace in the fact that we would be helping others. She specified that my grandfather's one and only tattoo should be used to refine the art that had aided in the investigation of a murder case with suspected cultist activity. 3 months later, my grandfather passed away. A memorial was held, and instead of a funeral, my aunts and uncles had planned for a park bench to be placed as a memorial. The body was sent to the morgue within the medical school, and I requested that the collection be made by my most trusted doctoral student, a promising young woman with whom I had worked for the past 2 years. She had the training required to obtain specimen as a forensics expert, and for obvious reasons, I would not be able to do it myself. We were also supposed to do the experiment together. However, since Samantha spiked the fever lasting 2 days, she had to stay home for 2 weeks, even after testing negative. It was school policy, so I found myself hunched over a lab table alone in a brightly lit room. For some reason, I was relieved that she wouldn't be here. Perhaps I could still respect my late grandfather's wishes for privacy after all. I wasn't always alone, but the postdocs were working on their own research and barely paid any attention to mine. Researchers tend to obsess if you haven't noticed. The process was difficult. People think scientists are magicians able to make large, complicated molecules from scratch, but we simply use processes that already exist in nature. I'll spare you the details of that though. If you want to look up how fluorescent tags are made, Google it. Some people may be sensitive to the information. I suppose I should clarify what I mean when I say a tattoo covers another. It doesn't. The ink is injected into the dermis, the layer of skin under the epidermis. It's several cell layers thick. Think of it like a building. The ink you deposit at the top is seen by you as a dot on the skin, but it can be on any floor of that building. A tattoo doesn't cover another, it blends into it well enough to form a new picture. Some ink dots fall on the third floor, others on the fifth, and the new tattoo is both above, below, and adjacent to the existing one. Considering my grandfather seemed to cover it himself, it was likely he used more ink than he needed. It also meant that he didn't even want the tattoo artist to know what it was. What could be so bad? What had his father or his mother, before her eventual recovery, do to him? I was afraid of that answer. I knew he had suffered, but learning the specifics would likely be difficult, even though I remember a happy man who had separated himself from the past, always looking forward. I took samples from all over the skin. They were small enough to not alter the overall image, but large enough to span all the floors. Several rounds in a centrifuge separated out the ink, and I used several processes to purify the substances in each sample. I took the pure substances and attached them to fluorescent antibodies. Then I took slices of my grandfather's skin and exposed them to the antibodies. I took pictures. I found out which substances belonged to which tattoo and removed pictures showing patterns of substances present in more than one tattoo. Night after night, I obsessed with this project, staying in my lab until the hours of early morning. I wasn't surprised to see the picture forming into words, but when they were developed to the point of legibility, to say I was stunned about what they said wouldn't even come close to describing what those words did to me as I sat on this very same chair. Ancient wisdom of the men who claimed the South through centuries ends. Transform the boy whose soul decays and grant him power once he slays. Transient state as he becomes a pupil to the chosen one, until he surpasses his master, locking eyes ends the disaster. Ye now Dlushi lost its worth, inside me I've swallowed his birth. Learned the rules that I must follow, she saved me from that place so hollow. Banished silence from my breast, laid my wounded soul to rest. Ashes yearning to possess the girl who thunders in my chest. Born again to live the life, to make the worthy one my wife. Destiny from the beginning, act of kindness, thus revealing. Once she sees, she'll be my bride, and by my side she will abide. For from my rib her life took shape, but from her love my heart escaped. I won't deny the Helene's fates. Though it took a moment to connect all of the dots, the most important part of my grandfather's poem was immediately obvious to me. It chilled me to the core, freezing my empty stomach into a solid block of ice. After a few internet searches confirmed what was more than just a suspicion, I felt myself go blank, thinking rapidly as I sat, unmoving, like a computer performing dozens of calculations while being completely impartial to their own existence. You see, my grandfather wasn't my grandmother's first love. She had first been engaged to a young man named Willie. Tragically, Willie perished when his vehicle lost control one night and he crashed into a row of trees, dying almost instantly. When he didn't come home, his father, his uncle, and a few men in the town went searching for him. They started with the route they knew he would take and quickly found the wreckage. The news devastated my grandmother and his best friend, my grandfather, who loved him dearly. They still spoke fondly of him. However, my grandmother had said that even though she lamented his tragic passing, she wouldn't have traded the life she'd built with my grandfather. She and Willie had been planning to get married the summer after high school. Since it was just after the Second World War, Willie and my grandfather had planned to join the army soon after, in case of any future threats. After their loss, my grandparents leaned on each other for support. They eventually found love, got married, and led a happy life. They did not feel guilty about this, as they both told me that Willie had said that the only other man he could ever trust her with was his best friend, Jimmy, my grandfather. He told them both that he wanted Jimmy to take care of her and his family if something were to happen to him overseas. My grandfather had asked the same of him, making Willie promise to take care of his mother if there was another war, and, like Grandma's brother, he didn't return from it. Grandma had cried that they were both joining, but they said they did so to protect the people they loved, and she believed them. In the beginning of his teen years, my grandfather's lack of social skills still clung to him. He wasn't liked, he had no friends, and though his father had been arrested for theft and exiled from the small community, the evils of the past still haunted him. As a child, the children made fun of his bad breath, skinny frame, and dirty clothes. They picked on him and he cried. Then, one day, he came to school with a broken arm. My grandmother asked him what happened, and he told her his paw gets angry and beats him, and he doesn't understand why he keeps messing up. Said that he also hurts his mom, and that his mom is broken on the inside, so her outside doesn't work. My grandma told her father, a preacher, who met with my grandpa's father to speak with him on the matter, offering to pray with him and free him from his troubles. He was met with hostility, and had he not brought deacons with him, he likely would have dealt with my great grandfather's violence. Things went from bad to worse for my grandfather, but he still appreciated the attempt at kindness from my grandmother. She would always bring extra bread, oat cookies, hard boiled eggs, peanut brittle. Whatever her mother made for her, she would pack just a little bit extra for my grandfather. This was before the war. When President Truman signed the National Act that guaranteed funding for school lunches across the country, the hungry kids stayed hungry. Also, for those of you who might be thinking, why didn't his dad go to jail for domestic violence? Well, it wasn't taken as seriously back then, especially in a small town. But it wasn't long before old Jim's alcoholism led to the loss of job after job. Unable to support his habits, he took to stealing. I'm not sure how long he was in jail for, but by the time he got out, he had ostracized himself enough from the community that he no longer saw the benefit in returning. My grandfather and his mother never saw him again. His mother took up a job as a cleaning lady, cleaning houses here and there to put food on the table and pay the property tax. Tensions in the house lessened, but the depression caused by the years of abuse lingered, and my great grandmother was unable to reconnect to her child. He grew up an emotionally stunted boy without friends. He stayed to himself, wasn't able to talk with people, and worked at a local factory to help his mom with money. He gave her everything, but in 1938, he lost that job to an act that restricted factories from hiring children under 16. He fell into his own depression, but he was still very smart, earning good grades in school. Then the war hit, and his mother was able to start her own job at the factory that now manufactured weapons instead of tools used for construction. All of this information was passed down to me by my grandmother and her mother, which she learned from her own grandmother. My grandfather refused to speak about his past. Whenever someone mentioned it, he would always smile and say that it's better to look to the future and that he'd left that life behind and been born into a better world because of my grandmother. When she was 16, my grandmother started dating Willie. A year later, Willie had a chance encounter with Jimmy where they bonded over their mutual love of sports radio. Jimmy had walked up to Willie, frustratedly beating a broken farm radio and asking if he could sit with him to listen. By the end of the game, they were both jumping in the air and became fast friends. My great grandmother said that their friendship sparked new life into her son, and that life drew her out of her own depression. He invited her to events hosted by my grandmother's family, and they always treated her with kindness. She became an active member of the church, and the mother son duo went around every Christmas, bringing homemade toys to poor children year after year. The similarities between Jimmy and Willie were astounding. They liked the same foods, listened to the same music, the same things that made one happy made the other happy, and the things that filled them with righteous anger never differed. In their final school year, Willie proposed to my grandmother, but he died before being able to graduate. My grandparents supported each other emotionally and leaned on one another to overcome their grief. My grandmother had also lost her brother, which compounded her sorrow. She once confided that she had come on to my grandfather just a few months after the death, but that he stopped her. He had told her that he had loved her for a long time, but that he wanted her to heal before beginning any sort of relationship with him. He promised her that though he expected nothing from her, he would wait for her until the end of time. They were married 2 years later, and my grandmother said that both men had the same beautiful soul, and that since they had received Willie's blessing, and since my grandfather made them both wait, there was no guilt involved in their union. The rest was history. A beautiful love story, one of the most beautiful I'd ever heard before I read this poem. You see, there is a philosophical principle called Occam's razor, where the easiest or most plausible explanation for a problem is likely the correct one. It is why I believe the Earth is round, even though I've never seen it from outer space. Our physics calculations of the trajectory of airplanes wouldn't work in a flat Earth, and adding an entire worldwide cover up involving multiple governments simply complicates the problem. Applied to forensics, the easiest explanation is the most likely one. If there are a bloody set of footprints going both ways, up and down a hill, and you can tell that the body had been at both places, even if the amount of blood is similar, you can assume that the victim was killed uphill and then carried or dragged down, rather than killed at the bottom and dragged up. It's much easier to carry dead weight downhill. If the bullet fired from someone's gun is found at a crime scene, it is more likely that it was fired by a person with regular access to that gun and knowledge of where it is normally kept, rather than a stranger who broke in and stole it in order to commit the crime. Which is why I felt my entire world breaking down. My knowledge of psychology and childhood development told me that my grandfather's case was a miracle, and that his drive to make things better for himself and his mother simply didn't match the behavior of the boy leading up to that point. It is perfectly normal for a child to grow up to help and protect a neglectful parent, but they usually show signs of this throughout their lives. My great grandmother had said that before he changed, my grandfather distanced himself, obsessing with something he kept hidden from her. She was too depressed to do too much about it or to want to know where he was going. She was honest when she said she was glad when he left, so that she didn't have to feel so guilty for being unable to see past herself and her own exhaustion and be a mother to her child. She would hear the sports radios, but he was always listening meticulously, with a concentrated look on his face. She would hear him singing or repeating phrases said over the radio. He had a weekend job as a store clerk at 15, and he would use the money to buy himself new clothing and shoes. But it was more of a research, not a happy boy developing an interest. Then, one day, he came home with a smile on his face, wearing his new clothing. He kissed her cheek. He was a completely new person, and he saved her life. It was like he was her guardian angel, and she said it was just about the time he made friends with Willie. The two had the same tastes, the same hobbies, same styles, and they loved the same woman. But when you apply Occam's razor, is it more likely that my grandfather suddenly developed the same personality as his deceased best friend, including the same tastes, hobbies, dance styles, likes, and dislikes, and started showing them from one day to the next after about a year of almost never being home, even at night? That a maladjusted boy suddenly became outgoing, friendly, and knew exactly how to talk to people. That he had befriended the boyfriend of the little girl who had shown him that something good can exist in this world. That Willie, usually an extremely safe driver with his father's vehicle, was going almost double the speed limit, saw something in the road, and veered off the path, dying instantly in the process. Or is it more likely that a disturbed little boy who has never shown love from his parents, who never felt safe, who never psychologically developed, who never matured to have normal relationships, who was never shown how to love, became obsessed with the only person in his childhood to show him kindness and relieve his pain, that would give him food daily, and that gave him something to look forward to, that when he saw her start to date someone, He realized that he could learn exactly what she wanted in a man. He could learn the right things to do and the right way to do them, and the right things to say, the right clothes to wear, the right exercises to follow, the right songs to listen to. He could practice mimicking the boy while watching outside his window, and since he was invisible to everyone around him, stalk him in broad daylight, hanging out at his favorite places, often showing up before him and watching him interact with his friends. That he suddenly bumped into him with a broken radio and became fast friends with him as they bonded over the same sports teams, the same favorite players, the same opinions, the same goals, the same favorite songs, the same drinks, the same foods, and the same girl. That once he became part of the friends group, he never tried to court any other girls, paying them almost no attention, even though many of my grandmother's friends had professed their interest in this charming young man who stepped up to take care of his mother in his father's absence, who saved her from getting lost in herself. Is it possible that the first scenario would result in the words etched on his skin? Words that referenced the wise men who ruled the South, the Navajo people who migrated to the area of New Mexico as early as the 1400s and have lasted to this day. That Navajo mythology spoke of the Yinaldlushi, witches who gained the ability to transform into any animal after an initiation rite where they had to kill a close friend or family member, who could also possess a human through eye contact, and who are rumored to jump in front of vehicles to spook drivers and cause accidents, as could be determined by the mechanics of the crash. That a boy who was handy and dealt with machinery and who was familiar with cars could have broken his friend's speedometer, causing him to exceed the speed that would be safe for that road and then suddenly crash after a hard break when no one else was around. That he had the new tattoo shortly after the start of the new relationship, but refused to take off his jacket or wear short sleeves before then. My grandfather is a skinwalker, but not in the way you'd think. He never learned to love. His father beat him for sport, and his mother was too broken to love him, hug him, speak with him, feed him, or defend him. He lacked guidance, and any forensic psychologist would know that though many people with this kind of upbringing still grow up to be functional adults who are kind and generous and giving, many times much more than others, albeit sometimes requiring therapy, some grow up to become sociopaths and psychopaths with no ability for remorse. Some develop other mental disorders, and some become arsonists, rapists, and even serial killers. Then there is a little boy who obsessed over a little girl and, after learning what type of person she wanted, decided to become that person and then kill him. Decided to continue his life with her. According to Grandma, Grandpa never changed. He was just as amazing and charming as the day she re met him and started spending time with him as a teenager. She said she barely recognized him when Willie first tried to introduce her to his new friend, and that he never mentioned the past, and that when they were just friends, she never asked. I never met my real grandfather. He died before he even graduated high school. Instead, an empty person studied his every move, read his every thought, and practiced his mannerisms. Then he killed him and took over what was supposed to be his life, following his script to the T until the day he died. I don't know what I'm going to tell my grandmother. She'd led a happy life with my grandfather, and I don't want to tell her that the man she married died long ago. and that a monster that was really good at mimicking took his place. I'm not sure what I'll tell her. I'll think of something, but I have already corrupted the skin samples before me. Maybe I'll ruin it just enough to hide the true meaning of these evil words. Till then, I'll sit here in the horrible revelation that my mother's father, my grandfather, my grandmother's husband, this man was long dead, and that I, as the only other person with that knowledge, would have to carry this burden until it shared my grave. Ancient wisdom of the men who claimed the South through centuries ends, transform the boy whose soul decays, and grant him power once he slays. Transient state as he becomes a pupil to the chosen one, until he surpasses his master, locking eyes ends the disaster. Yinaldlushi lost its worth. Inside me, I've swallowed his birth. Learned the rules that I must follow. She saved me from that place so hollow. Banished silence from my breast, laid my wounded soul to rest. Ashes yearning to possess the girl who thunders in my chest. Born again to live the life, to make the worthy one my wife. Destiny from the beginning, act of kindness thus revealing. Once she sees she'll be my bride, and by my side she will abide. For from my rib her life took shape, but from her love my heart escaped. I won't deny the Helene's fates. That concludes our story for today. I hope you enjoyed my blend of science fiction and Native American lore. I chose the Yinadlushi pronunciation of the word skinwalker in Navajo because it is the one I found most often, though there were other pronunciations. Navajo is a widely spoken language stretching across the southwestern United States, so having different pronunciations for the same thing doesn't surprise me. Please like, comment, share, and subscribe. I am looking to post content on a regular basis and have a few stories already fully typed out. I'd love to know what my listeners are thinking. If you want to send me a prompt request, you can do so at stories@creepyconceptions.com. Magnificent artwork can be commissioned by emailing the exquisitely skillful Kanarushi at commissions@kanarushistudios.com. You will find both emails linked in the description below. Once again, I truly hope you enjoyed this creepy conception of mine. Till next time, stay creepy, my lovelies.